for inviting me. It just feels good to be back at ISI, even though it's just virtual. So today I'm going to talk about my paper, which essentially studies the
Wow. Hmm.
connection between two aggregate phenomena in the US. One is the secular change in female labor supply, and the second is this phenomena called jobless recovery, which has been occurring in the last three recessions in the US, wherein aggregate employment recovery is weak and essentially lags the rebound in aggregate productivity. So let me start by showing the evolution of female labor supply in the US over time. So this is the employment to population ratio for women, and as you can see, that there is a strong upward trend till around the late 1980s, post which the trend weakens and essentially levels off. So let's look at what the employment recoveries have looked like in the US in the last five recessions. So in this graph, I'm plotting the prime age employment to population ratio, and I'm plotting the percentage deviation from what the pre-recession peak was. And each of these lines represent the evolution of employment for a particular recession. So in this graph, if you see that for the first two recessions, the 73-75 recession and the 81-82 recession, once the recession is over, so for example, in the 73-75 recession, it lasts for around 2 years. Once it's over, employment starts to go back up. However, in the next three recessions, employment recovery has, even after the recession has been over, employment either remains the same or continues to decline and starts to show a rebound much later. And in fact, even in terms of the speed of recovery, that's less as compared to the pre-1990 recessions. So this phenomena is known as jobless recovery, and this is something that has been happening for the last three recessions in the US. So,
Can I ask a quick question, Pubali? So the green line is the great financial crisis, right? So, and we know that recessions driven by financial crises tend to have recoveries that take longer, and the severity of these crises are much more. So in a way, in this diagram, you're comparing apples with oranges, right? The first four seem to be, garden variety type recessions. So is it fair to put that green line there? I mean,
so actually, when I look at the different pictures, this green line is going to be a bit of an anomaly, as you mentioned, that the effect in this particular recession was much stronger. But the way that I would like you to think about this would be the recessions prior to 1990 and the recessions post 1990. And because there were just three recessions post 1990, I have included this in terms of like just a completion of the picture. But the big difference here is in terms of the pre-1990 recessions and the post-1990 recessions. But you're right that the green line is a bit of an anomaly in terms of its effect as compared to the other recessions.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So why do I think that the graph in the previous slide could have something to do with what we see here? It's because in terms of the timing of these events, there seems to be a correlation in the sense that the trend had started to weaken around the 1990s, and you see this kind of a jobless recovery phenomena starting around the 1990s. But more importantly, if you look at the same picture, employment to population ratio deviations from the pre-recession peak for these different five recessions, for women and men separately, you find that for men, all these, apart from, of course, the Great Recession, the other recessions have shown slow employment recoveries. However, for women, the pre-1990 recessions were showing brisk employment recoveries, and there is a slowdown that's happening for women. So that brings me to the question in this paper which is, are there connections between these two phenomena? So does the weakened trend in female labor supply contribute to jobless recovery? And in order to understand this relationship better, I start by looking at which groups of women were responsible for this steep trend that existed prior to 1990. Are those the same groups of women that have been showing brisk employment recoveries prior to 1990 and have changed their recovery patterns? What were the underlying demographic factors that have also changed around that time that these groups of women were responding to? And finally, whether the insight that I get from what I learn can help to think about some kind of policies that can stimulate employment during a jobless recovery now. So these are the questions I ask. How do I go about answering these questions? So I start with a microdata analysis using the current population survey, the March annual supplement data. And I look at which groups of women drive the secular trend and which groups of women have changed their employment recoveries. So what I find is that for both of these, it's actually not all women, but particularly married women who were young and had young children at home, who were not only driving this steep trend prior to 1990 and are not doing so now, but were also showing brisk employment recoveries prior to 1990 and are not doing so now. So given what I learned from the data, that helps me to develop this general equilibrium model, which accounts for these different kinds of households. So I have households which differ with respect to their age, with respect to their marital status, with respect to the number of children that they have at home. And there is an endogenous asset distribution that affects these labor supply choices. And these labor supply choices end up affecting what that asset distribution would look like. In this framework, once I calibrate the model to the starting point, which in my analysis is 1968, then I allow for changes in 4 different demographic factors, namely the gender wage gap, which narrowed over time, the changes that happened in terms of the number of young children that households had, which also reduced over time, changes in marriage rates and changes in divorce rates. All these 4 things I can see in the data, and I incorporate that in my model and allow the agents in my model to respond. And using this framework, I establish causality between the weakened trend and the jobless recoveries. Now, I show that consistent with what I find in the data, I show that even in my model, this is driven by young married women with children who are driving both the trend as well as the brisk recoveries. And then when I compare what is the relative contribution of these 4 different demographic factors that also changed over time, I find that although overall, as far as the overall change is concerned, the narrowing of the gender wage gap is important. But if you focus during that time where the women were showing these brisk recoveries and the steep trend, during that time, it's actually a fall in the number of young children, which is a crucial factor. So essentially what I want to talk about is, and what I want to argue is that there is a cost associated with raising children at home for women, which when reduces over time, allows women to increase their labor supply. So based on what I find from the model, then I conduct some experiments with some different kinds of countercyclical policies. So the first one is a market childcare subsidy, where essentially the cost of buying childcare from the market reduces during a recessionary episode, and essentially, reducing the cost of raising children, and compare that to a targeted income tax break, which to some extent reduces the gender wage gap. And I compare the effectiveness of these 2 policies. What I find is that both dampen the effect of a recession. However, the childcare subsidy is more effective in stimulating employment recovery. So that's what really my paper is about. And in terms of where this paper lies in the literature, so it caters to two broad strands of the literature. One is the secular trend in female labor force participation, the different reasons that have contributed to that. And the other is the explaining the emergence of these jobless recoveries in the last few recessions in the US. My paper lies at the intersection of these two and is closely related to these three other papers, which also talk about the relationship between these two phenomena. In terms of the contribution of my paper as compared to these other papers which also exist, I show that women's recoveries are, again, they differ with respect to their age, with respect to the marital status, and with respect to the number of young children that they have at home. And this general equilibrium model that I have, which allows for endogenous asset accumulation, helps me to quantify date by date what is the relative contribution of these changing demographic factors. And this general equilibrium framework then helps me to evaluate what kind of policies might work in mitigating jobless recoveries. So that's the contribution of this paper. So this is a broad roadmap of this talk. So I'll start with showing you what the results are from the data analysis, which helped me to then develop a general equilibrium model. Once I calibrate the model to replicate what the labor supply would look like in 1968, I allow these demographic trends, namely the gender wage gap, number of young children at home, marriage rates, divorce rates, these four factors to change over time. And I allow agents in my framework to respond to these different changes. Once I validate that my model is doing a good job of replicating what the data looks like, then I introduce aggregate shocks in my framework at a time when the trend is present and at a time when basically it has leveled off. And I study what the response of the economy to the same shocks would be. And finally, I talk about some countercyclical policies which could be effective in periods where we see this jobless recovery occurring now. All right. So let me start by showing the data. So what I do is I look at the employment to population ratio for different groups of the population. So I divide the population by age, I divide the population by marital status and the number of young children. So here I've shown you on the left panel, the evolution of employment to population ratio for women, married and single, and similarly for men. So what I find here is that the change was primarily driven by married women, not so much changed in terms of single women. I mean, it increased, the employment to population ratio increased over time, but it was predominantly driven by the change for married women. And what I find is when I subdivide this group on the basis of age and the number of young children, I find that this is stronger for young married women and young married women with young children at home. For men, there has been a decline in terms of the employment to population ratio. However, the decline has not been as much as the increase that has taken place for married women. And this is important because if overall, over time, increase in labor force participation by women, married women, just meant that married men were reducing their labor force participation at the same rate, then in aggregate, there wouldn't be much of a difference. But the fact that we don't see this happening is going to be important in terms of looking at what the effect, the change in terms of women how that would map back into the aggregate picture. I've done a similar analysis in terms of employment recoveries. Now here I'm showing you, again, I've looked at different subgroups. I'm showing you the picture for married women with children and without children. And again, you can see that in terms of the employment to population ratio, the married women with children, this group is essentially mirroring the picture that we saw for all women. not so much is different with respect to married women with no children across these different recessions. And again, this effect is stronger for young married women with young children at home. I do look at women across different education levels as well. However, I don't see much of a difference with respect to women who are college educated versus women who are high school educated. I don't see much of a difference with respect to the education levels. So for that reason, that's not a dimension of heterogeneity that I account for. So given my understanding of what I find, that helps me to develop a general equilibrium model. So I have in my model, I have households which are different with respect to their age, with respect to their marital status. And if they are single, then with respect to the gender of the household head and the number of young children that they have. I account for an endogenous asset distribution. Households derive utility from market consumption, from home production, which is synonymous to childcare in my framework, uh, and, and leisure. Households decide how much to consume, how much to save, how much labor each individual is going to supply to the market, how much labor is to be supplied at home, which essentially is going to give rise to this childcare. And this childcare production has to take into account the number of children. So if you have more children, then you have to produce more of this commodity to take essentially take care of the number of children. On the form side of the economy, things are fairly simple. So there is a representative firm which hires labor and rents capital, and there are competitive prices. So the base wage and the base rental rate, they are solved competitively. There is a gender wage gap for women, which is distortionary. So there are different ways to model this gender wage gap. The literature talks about differences in productivity, which essentially have shrunk over time, which feeds back into the wage earned by women. And the way I have modeled it is it's just discrimination. It's just from a firm side, firms don't differentiate between the different kinds of labor, but women, because of some discrimination, receive a lower wage as compared to men. Now, let me talk a little bit more about the households. So all households live and work for a finite number of years, J. Single households, they face this exogenous probability of getting married in the next period, which is something that I can again measure from the data. What is the marriage rate? And single households face this equilibrium asset distribution of these potential partners. So because that is going to feed into the labor supply choices that these households are going to make. Because in the future, if you do get married, then there is some probability with which you're going to get matched to an individual who has saved an X amount, and that is going to contribute to what your household wealth would be in the future as well. So this is important because usually with these kinds of heterogeneous agent frameworks, the distribution matters in terms of how it influences prices, and then prices feed into the different decisions. But in this framework, the households need to know the exact distribution of assets in terms of their potential partners. And this essentially poses a tricky fixed point problem, which I'm able to overcome in my model solution. For married households share consumption, and they weight individual utilities. The utilities that how the different individuals derive from leisure is what is weighted in terms of the household utility. I assume that women are the ones who supply labor at home to produce childcare. Now, this may seem like an extreme assumption that I do not allow for men to supply labor endogenously, but based on time use studies, it has been seen that there is a big asymmetry that exists in terms of the time spent by men and women in a married household, taking care of household activities and taking care of children. So this is an assumption that I make. And married households face these exogenous divorce shocks, which is again something that I can see from the data. And in the event of a divorce, the assets are just split into half. Conditional on age, marital status, and gender, each household has a fixed number of children. So what I do is I calculate what the average number of children would be for each of these different groups. And that is again something that I feed into my model. So this home produced childcare has this consumption equivalence parameter, which takes into account the number of children. So in the previous slide and in this one, the things that I've highlighted in pink are these 4 different demographic factors, which I allow to change over time in my framework. So this is broadly the setup of my model. So let me show you some Bellman equations. So for the single households problem, single households differ with respect to their age, with respect to what their wealth level is, and their age, with respect to their gender, their wealth level, and their age. They choose how much to consume, how much labor to supply to the market, how much labor to supply at home to produce childcare, and how much to save. And this is what their current period utility is. And their future utility is basically a weighted sum of these 2 future values. The future value if they are married, which occurs with probability given by P. And in the event that they get married and they get matched to somebody who had an asset level K prime tilde, then their total sum becomes the total wealth in the future becomes the sum of what they save and the savings of whoever they get married. And what is the probability that they get matched to somebody who had saved K prime tilde? That's denoted by this theta term here. And this theta is an endogenous object. And this is just if they do not receive this marriage shock, they continue to remain single in the future. And this is the budget constraint where basically this is the income, the labor income, and this is the capital income. And this is the constraint for home production. Similarly,
Pubali, yes. One small question, like, can you explain that chi, whatever, the CHO divided by that part? Yeah. So what is that?
This chi is essentially the consumption equivalence. So this is taking
in terms of consumption.
Yes, the number of children. So you need to produce more childcare if you have more children at home.
But you would also spend more NH if you had more children, no?
Exactly. So so essentially that will be an equilibrium outcome. So if you have more children, because you will be maximizing your utility, you want to maximize the CH, you will be choosing to supply more labor at home, and this is an equilibrium outcome. Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
So sorry, can I just ask one more question? Yes. So why do you need this indicator? Is this one here is, so this tells you
so here I have households living for a finite number of years. So if there will be a future if J is less than capital J. So they live for capital J periods. There won't be a future if they are standing at period J, in which case this is the current period utility.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Sorry, Pubali, one more question. So subject to C plus K prime is mine, right? K prime is, so I'm talking about the budget constraint that you have, yes. C plus K prime.
Yes.
Right? Yes. And that does not include K prime tilde. I mean, it's not like joint income.
So this is my decision as a single household today. And I decide how much I want to consume and how much I want to save, which is K prime.
So it's now households.
So this is just a single individual who is synonymous with a single household in that sense.
Yeah,
K,
but sorry, but
yeah.
I'm taking into consideration that K prime plus K prime tilde, right? If I am matched with someone,
Mhm.
in that case, in my budget constraint, don't you think that K prime should also appear somewhere? No.
K prime tilde.
Yeah.
So the matching happens in the next period, not today.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
so somebody who is the potential partner is also solving their own problem, which is a single household's problem, and decides that this is going to be K prime tilde is that person's optimal choice. So tomorrow, when tomorrow arrives, before households make any decisions, there is the matching that takes place. In case the matching takes place, then essentially you are no longer single. So
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
couple household, you will be making your decisions in the future.
Yeah, I have understood that part, like this value function part I've understood. I'm just thinking like in the budget constraint, nowhere this K prime tilde is appearing. And that's why like I was thinking like when I am deciding my CN, NH and K prime, is there any way other than the utility this K prime tilde is affecting my choices? No, you are saying no.
No, this is today's budget constraint. And I mean, there is a probability that I may get matched in the future. But when I decide, the way K prime tilde is going to affect the choices would be through the utility function, not through the budget constraint. Because today what I have is just my income and what I am receiving in terms of the rent on capital. And based on that, I decide how much to consume and how much to save.
Okay. 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 Thanks.
So for married households, now the current period utility depends on the utility of the male member and the utility of the female member, and they are weighted based on some exogenous. It's basically, I mean, you can think about these as bargaining weights, but they are just exogenously given. And this is the current period utility. The future utility depends on whether I receive this divorce shock or whether I do not. If I do not receive the divorce shock, then I just continue being a coupled household, and that's going to be my future value if I'm married. If I do receive the divorce shock, then the future value is going to be again sum of the weighted sum of future value of an individual who would be single. And this takes into account that the asset, there is a 50-50 split of the asset, uh, which feeds back in as, which enters the value function of the single household. The budget constraint is very similar. Here, I'm now accounting for the joint income of both the male and the female member of the household. And the other constraints are essentially similar. Okay, so this is really the problem for the single household and the married household. So let me move on to, because on the form side things are very straightforward. So let me move on to showing you what my parameter choices are. So some of them are preset from existing literature, and this is something that I'm still working on to complete the full calibration. But some of these parameters have been calibrated internally. So in particular, I try to match what the average hours would be for these different groups of the population in 1968. So that's the starting point of my analysis. So in terms of how my model does in 1968, so so the top panel shows the values of these four different demographic factors that I'm feeding in from the data. Again, the number of young children, this is essentially a matrix because this number varies across age, marital status. So these are my starting points, the 1968 values. The lower panel shows the data and the model counterparts of labor supply. So what do I mean by labor supply here? In terms of the data, I calibrated to the average hours worked, which includes all, the average is calculated accounting for all those who do not work at all. So includes all the zeros, and that's divided by the total number of hours that are available. And that gives me a measure of labor supplied. So I target to match the labor supplied by married women, married men, and single women. And my model does a good job in terms of the targeted moments, but also in terms of the untargeted moments. So for single men and in terms of the aggregate, also my model does a good job of replicating it. So this was the 1968 value. Now, all that I allow, the only thing that I allow to change over time are essentially these four demographic factors. These are the four things that change over time. None of the labor supplied by these different groups in 2014 is not targeted. So in terms of how my model does in reproducing what the picture would look like in 2014, so I'm essentially measuring the percentage change in labor supplied by married women, married men, single women, and single men. So what I find is that consistent with the data, women have increased, both married women and single women have increased their labor supply, and both groups of men, married men and single men, have reduced their labor supply. The increase for married women has been, the change for this group has been the maximum. So you can, and in terms of the magnitude also, you can see that in terms of the relative magnitude, my model does a good job. And this change is not as much as the decrease for married men. So in terms of both direction as well as the relative magnitude for each of these series, my model does a good job of replicating 2014, which is the ending point of my analysis. Okay, so this was just in terms of the steady state comparison. Let's look at what my model says in terms of the demographic transition that takes place. So in each of these, I have plotted for each of these different groups, the data and the model counterparts for percentage change in average hours from 1968. So you can see that the model in terms of married women is closely following the change that is seen in the data. So there is an increase and then there is a leveling off for married women. There are changes for these other groups that take place, but none of that is comparable to the change that takes place for the married women, this group. There is a bit of a difference. There's a little bit that I miss in terms of this overall change, but that's because if you see the literature on what are the different factors that have contributed to this change for married women, there is the idea of social norms changing. There is the idea of technological progress for home production that has resulted in this kind of a change. These are two things that I do not have in my model. So perhaps a bit of, those would have explained this change, that the difference between what my model predicts and what the data shows. And note that at this point, I have not introduced any shocks in my model. So, and the points where the model deviates from the data are essentially periods leading up to recessions or during recessionary episodes. Okay, so what is the mechanism that is really giving rise to this kind of a response for the agents in the household? So for married households, when the gender wage gap falls, that increases the benefits that women are going to receive if they work outside. So women increase their labor supply, and similarly, men reduce their labor supply. As the number of young children falls, now women are substituting the time that they have available from child work to market work. So in terms of their leisure, not much changes for women as compared to men, because for married men, when they reduce the labor that they are supplying to the market, then their leisure increases. The marginal utility of men's leisure falls, and as a result, there is low crowding out that takes place. Similarly, for single women and single men, so for single women, as the gender wage gap falls, they do increase their labor supply, but not by as much as for married women, because there is a stronger income effect, as for single women, they are only depending on their own income. As marriage rates fall, that also incentivizes them to increase their labor supply, because the future income pooling, the probability of future income pooling is now becoming less likely. And since over time, men are receiving, relatively, men are earning more as compared to women. So that incentivizes them to increase their labor supply as the marriage rates fall. Similarly, for single men, what I do find is that the opposite holds true for single men in terms of the gender wage gap and the reduction in marriage rates. I do find that an increase in the number of young children for single men households incentivizes them to reduce their labor supply. But I mean, I would not take this result very seriously, because for single men, I think there are other factors which contribute to a reduction in their labor supply, which are not included in this model. All right. So this is really the mechanism that's playing out in
Just
terms
one,
of how.
Pubali, one clarificatory question here. So you have single men, and if I can remember correctly, you assume that the male men are not there to produce out CH, right? No. So what did you
So
assume
that
there?
yeah, so that was for married households. So if you
Uh,
have married households, then in married households, women supply labor at home to
okay.
produce childcare.
So if they are not married, then they're individually producing that good. Okay,
Yes.
that is the assumption. Okay. Okay.
Yes. All right. So now let me look at the relative contribution of these different demographic factors. So so this is the picture for married women. And the exercise that I conduct here is that in the benchmark case, I allow all these four different factors to change over time. And I allow agents to respond in terms of their labor supply to all these four different factors. For each of these series, I essentially shut down. So, for example, for this red line, I do not allow changes in the number of young children post 1968. So, suppose the number of young children remained at the 1968 level throughout, and the other factors changed. What would be lost? So, this difference is essentially measuring what would be lost in terms of explaining labor supply if I did not allow the number of young children to change. So this measures the relative contribution of each of these different factors. So when I do this kind of a division along the transition, what I find is that if you look at the overall change, the gender wage gap narrowing down seems to matter. However, remember that women were showing the steep trend that existed for women was around this time, prior to the 1985, where it's actually the number of young children that seems to be the fall in the number of young children at home seems to be the most important factor, which contributes to this overall change. This is something that I would have missed if I had looked at just a steady state to steady state factor decomposition. So this table shows just in terms of the overall change, which of the factors seem to be most important. And you can see that for married women, in terms of the overall change, the gender wage gap seems to do everything, whereas number of young children reducing does not really do much. And this would be lost. And this interesting fact that the fall in the number of young children seems to matter would be lost if I had just done a snapshot comparison. So that's the key takeaway. Similarly, I've done this for single women, where again, for single women, the gender wage gap seems to matter, but also the reduction in the marriage rates seem to play a big role in terms of increasing their labor supply. And I've done this for married men and married women as well. So given that now my model, so all of this, again, I have not introduced shocks up until this point. So once I've validated that my model is doing a good job in terms of replicating essentially what the data would have looked like, now I come to the question that I had started off with. Does the weakened trend in female labor force participation contribute to the emergence of jobless recovery? So this is just, showing you the data counterpart that I had already shown in terms of the employment recoveries, prime age employment to population ratio in the data. And I'll be looking at a similar picture in my model. So what is the exercise that I conduct in my model? So I allow agents to respond to an aggregate shock in 1973 when there is this trend that is present. And I allow agents to respond to the exact same shock at a later date, post 1990, when this trend is now absent. And so this is the same aggregate shock that agents are responding to pre-1990 and post-1990. And the answer to the question whether the trend drives brisk recoveries is yes. The model predicts that you would not see these brisk recoveries without the secular trend. So this is the main result of this paper. This is in terms of the aggregate picture. Now, as we saw in the data counterpart, this was not driven by, so this was primarily driven by women. This is what the data showed, that this was primarily driven by women, not much really changed in terms of men. And my model also generates the same result, that the trend is driving brisk recoveries only for women, not so much for men. And not so much for men, and not all groups of women, as we saw in the data, that married women are the ones who have really changed in terms of their recovery patterns. It's consistent with what I find in my model as well. So in my model, also married women are driving brisk recoveries prior to 1990. So I don't explicitly here show you the age division and the division with respect to the number of young children, because in my framework at this point, the way children enter my framework is in terms of average numbers. So essentially, everyone in my model will have children. The numbers are going to vary based on whatever the average is in that particular group. But then again, since the reduction in the number of young children seems to be the contributing factor that is driving this particular change, the results are going to be similar if I were to segregate the population based on the number of young children. Similarly for age. At this point, I do not have a role of age beyond the presence of young children, but that's something that I'm working on with respect to incorporating a life cycle earnings path for age, which will highlight the role of age beyond just the presence of children. All right. So finally, based on what I learned from my model, then I extend my framework to consider some policies where suppose the fiscal authority has a goal to mitigate jobless recovery. So what I do is now
Pubali,
yes.
sorry, I have a question here. So can you tell me a bit about the shock that you have assumed?
So I have taken a TFP shock at this point, and households are just responding to. I think the shock that I had assumed is slightly bigger than usual. It's like a 5% TFP shock, and that is something that I allow the agents to respond to the same shock in a pre-1990 era and a post-1990 era.
So only TFP shock that you have assumed that you have in this.
Yes, at this point, that is the only shock that I was.
Okay. Thank you.
Pubali, just a follow up on that. But we know that there's a lot of variation in TFP growth across your sample, right? So from 1968 to 2014, you see, 70s, you see very poor productivity growth. In the Clinton years, you see high productivity growth. In the Obama years, you see, again, low productivity growth. So
Right. So
Is it fair to say that they're responding to the same shock?
so essentially what I wanted to see is so definitely. So in fact, in terms of, even the literature that talks about jobless recovery, some of the factors are with respect to changes, for example, on the demand side. So there could be changes that are happening with respect to the kinds of jobs these workers are doing. There are losses, this whole literature on job polarization, and those are the kinds of jobs that never come back. What I wanted to do for my exercise is, suppose nothing changed in terms of the two shocks that they receive. In terms of labor supply, would I see differences? So for that, in order to conduct that kind of a counterfactual, I had to assume that agents are receiving the same shock pre-1990 and post-1990. The only difference that exists in these two eras is in terms of what the labor supply patterns would look like in terms of the demographic changes that are happening. And given that, whether that itself contributes to this kind of a jobless recovery. So I needed to do it in a controlled
Sure.
environment because of that.
No, I understand that, but I'm saying households in the model cannot anticipate the shock, right? But once the shock is realized, they
They
presumably
can,
can see the time path of the shock. So if the shock is different in magnitude across both those subperiods, presumably once the shock is realized, they can anticipate the fact that, a shock hitting in the post-1990s period is going to be probably more drastic, or if it was in the 70s, it was more drastic. If it was in the 2000s, it was less drastic, or stronger or weaker. So,
so so I'm
yeah.
so in terms of what my households are being able to see at this point is, suppose even in terms of the evolution, they can see that the evolution of the shock would, suppose it's exactly the same in these two eras.
Mhm.
Given that there are just the differences are just in terms of the demographic factors, would things be different? That's what I'm asking. If I go to the data to replicate those recessionary episodes, then definitely, the shocks would look different. But that's not the exercise that I'm pursuing.
Right, but what I'm saying is that presumably there's some reverse causation between the trajectory of the shock after it's realized and its feedback into, let's say, the gender wage gap and stuff like that. So,
I see. I see. Um,
but uh,
I see.
anyway, go on. I think that's probably too difficult to model, but just
That's
curious.
something that I'll have to think about. Um, yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. So suppose the fiscal authority has a goal to mitigate jobless recoveries. So now I extend the existing theoretical framework that I had to account for a childcare sector. So far till now, households didn't. The only way that you could have childcare, the only way that you could produce childcare would be if you supplied labor at home to essentially, give rise to this childcare. But suppose now households had the option of buying childcare from the market at an equilibrium price, and the childcare sector is just hiring labor to produce this childcare. And there are taxes that are imposed on wage and rental income, which together with government expenditure is used to fund these two different policies that I consider. So one is subsidizing the price of market produced childcare. And again, this is going to change as the shock realizes. So this is counter cyclical. And similarly, I allow for an income tax break for married women. So the first one essentially reduces the cost of raising children. The second one essentially works to narrow the gender wage gap. And when I compare the effectiveness of these policies, I find that in as compared to a case with no policy, the narrowing of the gender wage gap, the the income tax break, which is essentially like narrowing of the gender wage gap, really doesn't do much. However, the childcare subsidy helps to stimulate this recovery in terms of the aggregate hours work. And the reason why this is doing so is because when you reduce the price of buying childcare from the market, that increases the demand for childcare. And because there's an increase in demand for childcare, that increases the demand for workers in that childcare sector, and that helps to increase the equilibrium employment in this economy, in case of the childcare subsidy, as compared to the targeted income tax break. And again, this is driven not by all women, but if you look at the division by gender for female and male, again, it's driven by women. And it's not driven by all women, but it's driven by married women. And again, so it's again consistent with what I find in the basic framework of my model. So that's really what I have worked on in this paper so far. So let me just give you a conclusion with respect to what I have covered, and then let me talk a little bit about what I'm working on right now. So in terms of the questions, I start with whether there's causality between this weakened trend in female labor force participation and jobless recovery, and whether there's something exploitable about this that we can take to shape policies which can stimulate employment recovery now if we see episodes of jobless recovery. So I start with a microdata analysis to find the different groups of women that drive the secular trend and that change employment recoveries. And I find that it's this group, young married women with young children, which is the important group. And then that helps me to develop a general equilibrium model which accounts for these different kinds of households and this endogenous asset distribution. And using my model, I establish causality between the weakened trend and jobless recoveries. And I find that consistent with the data, the groups that drive both trend and risk recoveries are essentially the same.
Yes. Yeah, please.
Okay, so it's essentially the same as what I see in the data. And then I use my model to quantify the contribution of these underlying demographic factors. Finally, I compare the certain policies that can be implemented now in episodes of jobless recovery. And I find that the market childcare subsidy is more effective in not only dampening the downturn, but also increases helps in speeding up the recovery. And so this is what I have done so far. What I'm currently working on is, as I showed you in the childcare sector, so I introduced the childcare sector in terms of the policy comparison, but since the main finding of this paper is that there is a cost of raising children, which seems to have reduced over time, I am essentially accounting for a childcare sector and resolving the model to see how changes in the price associated with childcare would feed back into the decisions of households endogenously. So that's something that I'm currently working on. And as I mentioned, I'm incorporating a separate role of age beyond. At this point, it just matters in terms of the number of young children you have, but specifically accounting for an age-specific earnings profile. Then I'm adding a retirement phase, because in my model so far, agents were, finitely lived, and they were working throughout their lifetime, which not adding a retirement phase essentially does not allow me to compare what my model does in terms of the asset distribution, which I would be able to see in the data. So the retirement phase helps with that. And then I want to quantify what the role of this equilibrium asset distribution would be in this framework. So I've ended some minutes early, but this is essentially what my paper is about. Thank you.
Pubali, there's a question in the chat. So
Oh.
the question is, are the increase in women labor supply and decline in men labor supply both regulated by the increase in informalization of work?
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
So Vijay, you asked the question. If you want to maybe just unmute yourself and ask, perhaps. Okay, he's not. Yep, go ahead, Vijay. Okay, I can't quite hear him. Okay, we'll come back. We'll come back to Vijay later on. If there are any other questions, please go ahead and ask them.
Hi, Pubali. My name is Juan. I have a question. But I'm quite interested. Thank you for the presentation. And I would like to know if there is any, or if you have go deeply in, particularly in the female labor participation, and I'm talking about part-time and full-time job, particularly in the initial trends and the motivation of the topic, to see if the part-time jobs and full-time jobs might change or might explain something of that, because you might think that there is a market labor change and there are more part-time job offers, so women are more willing to take those offers.
Right. So in the way that I have looked at employment, I am accounting for both part-time and full-time. Off the top of my head, I don't remember how each of these groups changed their. So if it is the case that women increased their part-time work over time, and as a result, that's feeding into the rise in female employment, that's something that I'll have to check. But my sense is that even in terms of full-time work, even if I do look at only people who are doing full-time work, even for them the change occurred in the way that I see in terms of the aggregate picture. So even if I did condition on that, I would see something similar for full-time workers as well. But that's something that I should perhaps look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, can I ask? I have two quick questions. The first is about do you have like this general equilibrium effect of the government? Who pays for this childcare subsidy? That's the first question. And the second question is the childcare sector that you create is also like a sector where only female can provide childcare, or it's like free for anybody to work in that sector?
No, so in the childcare sector, anyone can work that I create. And the way that I have at this point, who is paying for this policy? So I have wages and I have rental income, and then I have a measure of government expenditure, which essentially is just is funding this policy. So if you're thinking in terms of some kind of what would be the optimal policy here, that's not what I'm solving for here. However, when I do compare these two different policies, when I do compare these different policies, I do account for I normalize it by the same expenses for both these policies, depending on that, which one is more effective. So so in that sense, it's a comparison, but at this point, this is what is essentially funding the policy. So that was the first question. And then the second question was that in the childcare sector, again, there's no differentiation between men's work and men's labor and female labor. So anybody can work. However, the wages that they are going to earn, workers are going to earn, even in the childcare sector, is the same as the market wage rate. So it's, again, women are going to be subject to that discrimination or the gender wage gap, which they will be earning no matter where they work.
So just follow up. So that's what I'm thinking, that if it's like the demand side story playing out there, because you create more demand for that job because somebody is subsidizing that, and male have an advantage in working in that sector, then why don't they increase their labor in that particular sector, and only women increases?
No, um, let me think about that. So in terms of productivity, there's no difference. In terms of wages, yes, men earn more wages as compared to women, but um, the idea is that the response is from the women's side because of the fact that if they are not having to supply labor at home to take care of children, then they are the ones who free up. They substitute labor from working at home to working in the market. So because of that, these married women are more responsive as compared to men. Whereas men would have to substitute between leisure and market work. And as a result of that, you see a higher response for women, even though the wages that are earned relative to women is higher for men.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. We have time for more questions in case people have any.
Good evening.
Yep,
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah. Do we have more region-wise data, like for the coastal states and the southern states and the Appalachian states? I'm asking this because there have been deaths of despair in US since 2000. So is it because women there prefer, mostly in Appalachian area, is it because women they prefer to stay home and raise their child after seeing the sufferings of their parents and brothers and friends?
So in some sense, whether there's some role of um, um, maybe like the cultural aspect. So I have not actually, to be honest, I have not looked at the data based on region. I'm trying to remember if CPS has that. My guess is that I think there is a division with respect to, there will be some division with respect to state. But I have to look at that to say something conclusive with respect to whether different regions have seen different kinds of evolution of female labor force participation.
Okay, thank you.
Moni, you have a question?
Yeah, I can talk to her later.
Okay.
Sure.
So,
Shut up.
is
If
anyone
you have
else?
time, I can ask her. Otherwise, I'll talk to her later.
Yeah, we have loads of time. We have about 10 minutes.
Okay. So, Pubali, then I'm going back to your
Yes.
thing, and uh, so it looks like that if you are matched, then your utility is being augmented by the income of your spouse. So probably it's not a fair question, but I was just wondering if you have a billman for the household instead of one, like for the entire household, then do you think that you can, I know like you cannot, like unless you write it down and solve it and check, it's not very easy to say, but instead of writing one individual's problem, is it possible to write down the problem of the households and then the budget set that you have, or the set that you have can contain like all the income of the households. Is it possible to like
So
I don't know whether you'll have a different results or not, but my guess is that some of the income effects of the household may you are also possibly missing, and the only thing that is that is affecting your utility is like an exogenous shock, nothing more than that. Is this like correct? Or because you see, when you have this matching thing, when you are matched with your partner, I see your income is being augmented, your capital is being augmented, and therefore you have a higher value. Otherwise you will not have that effect. But right, but if you have a bailment for the entire family, then there can be some other like income effects. Say for example, the male member of the household is earning a lot, and that's why the female member is not willing to go outside and work. I'm not sure like those are the things that can be captured in this framework. Rather you need a bailment for the entire household. So do you want to say something about that?
So I think you're right in terms of, so this is the way I would think about this single household problem is I'm assuming that in this single household, the first thing is that in terms of the partner, the partner's income is not going to play a role here because this single household at this point has not been matched. But as compared to other members of the household, let's say if this member is living with his or her parents, and or there are other members in the household who are working and who are bringing in um, some kind of income. That's something that I'm not being able to capture in this framework. That you're right about. But then the problem is that there will be variations. Then essentially I will have different kinds of single households. Some where there's one person who's working and who's bringing in some income. Then there would be like, depending on how many or maybe there could be an alternative group of single households which have additional members who are bringing in some income, where there is some additional income that's going to be there in the budget constraint. But then the question is whether the labor supply choices of all those individuals will be endogenized and not. So it's difficult to, I mean, it just makes this problem very complicated, because in the sense that there will be more additional choices that I might have to consider if I account for additional members in a single household. But you're right that this is something, I mean, the only thing here that I'm measuring is uh, whether I'm supplying labor, or at most in case of married households, if the partner is supplying labor. That's what I am accounting for. I'm not accounting for other members in the household who also might be present, who also might be working.
Okay, so I have a like kind of still a follow up about that policy thing, in the sense that when these women are working in household and taking care of the kids, you are not counting them as an employed person,
No,
possibly.
no,
No,
yes.
but the moment they start working in childcare sector, they end up doing same job, but you are counting them as employed actually. So
Right.
whatever employment gain is arising because of the policy is basically a measurement thing. It's not policy that's working on. Same women work out of the house, now do the same thing. You are counting them as employed. They were doing same thing because I see the income effect is not working at all. So this child care policy or whatever you are calling it, the subsidy, is basically just doing the substitution. You are pulling these women from the home and putting them in some other home, and you're counting them as employed. So do you think it's kind of good enough reason to say that this policy is working?
So, the difference between these women working at home versus working in this childcare sector is because even if they do the same work in the childcare sector, they'll be earning a wage associated with that when they are, but at home, they are, they're not, there's not a wage component associated with it. Now, So you're right that in some sense, when this kind of a policy is taken into account, there is a substitution that's happening from the home to the market. But when you're looking at the data and when you're looking at the number of employed individuals, then that would account for people who are employed in the childcare sector. But like if you're just staying at home taking care of children, that's not contributing towards employment. So that's what's essentially what I'm doing in this framework.
Okay, thank you.
Moni, I don't know if I answered your question completely.
Yeah, I'll talk to you later. Don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah, very nice talk. Yeah. This is another way of modeling probably, but yeah, very good. Is there any other question? No, I guess. Kanishko, you there?
I see Odeswit as unmuting yourself.
Okay.
So it's a clarificatory question. Why don't we see a similar employment effect for the single women?
So for single women, that does increase in terms of all these factors. It does increase their labor supply. There are two things that happen. One is that the reduction in the number of young children that has not been as prominent for single women as compared to in married households. And the second thing is that for single women, the income effect also plays a more important role. So the income effect is stronger for single women as compared to in married households. So as a result of that, the change in labor supply is less for single women as compared to that for married households.
So it can't be an artifact of the data, as in that single women are less representative in the population. So probably.
No, so this is a well accepted fact that just in terms of, if you just look at the data overall, this change primarily happened for married women, not so much for single women, in terms of their labor force participation. So I don't think it's a question of representation, but it's just the factors are playing out differently. That's what I find in my framework.
Thank you.
All right. So if there are no further questions, I want to congratulate our speaker on a very interesting talk, and all the participants as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Pubali.
Thank you.
Thank you.